Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. A lot of you guys have asked me, how does Affliction Warlock play in Shadowlands? Does the spec feel improved? Does it feel better? How does it perform in dungeons? And what is the potential for Affliction in particular with the new expansion? With all three Warlock specs going forward, only Affliction is the one that's getting a massive rework. And a rework that I thought it needed. But did Blizzard take the spec in the right direction? Does it feel better or worse? And how is it impacted in the game? I would have loved to make this video on all three specs, but only Affliction is the one that gotten massive changes. We will take a look at the basic Warlock aspects, but in particular I want to highlight Affliction and how it's looking for the new expansion of Shadowlands. My thoughts on the BFA version of Affliction is, it's alright, but I enjoyed Legion version of Affliction better. It's just something about the damage over time and the Master of Dots that kind of fallen off for me. Don't get me wrong, it's really cool, back in Legion, running around putting agony and corruption and then dropping a bunch of UAs on the enemy while maintaining that artifact weapon buff. Man, did things melt, and in some cases the spec was maybe even way too easy, but it was super effective. Who didn't enjoy playing with dots? Although in Battle for Azeroth I feel like dots have been taking a back step. When it's a little bit sad when I look at the breakdown of my damage in a boss fight and my dots aren't the top of my meters. I mean, maybe Unstable Affliction might be, followed by Shadowbolt, followed by Agony and Corruption. It's just something about it didn't feel right. I would want dots to be front and center in terms of my most damage, but never really panned out like that in Battle for Azeroth. Instead, in BFA, we have a very bursty playstyle, and first of all, for a spec that's all about damage over time, I expect for something like a Fire Mage or Destro Warlock with its explosive, fiery chaos damage to just obliterate the enemy in a massive, glorious explosion. But for an Affliction Warlock, what I felt was better feeling is damage over time, as in sustained damage, as in you're not gonna do the damage immediately, you gotta put the dots on the enemy first and let those dots roll for a little bit. But instead, Affliction became one of the best boss killers with the biggest burst in the opener, which is cool with certain specific talents, but the other talents weren't that competitive, so there you are. A dot-based class with the biggest burst possible, not really all that wanted in PvP, very slim chances of you doing well in dungeons, and very much overshadowed by destruction. With Shadowlands, it can only go up. So how did Affliction Warlocks change going into Shadowlands? Well, in a sense, Shadowlands Affliction isn't really all that different. It is better, but it's not completely foreign. They did add a couple new things that Affliction can do, but more importantly, there's more things as a Warlock you can do in dungeons and raids. So let's take a closer look at some of the talents, builds, as well as the changes that are going to be massive for your lock. There are many mechanics for us to talk about Affliction, but before we talk about the Affliction change, I really got to mention how much I like curses. It's a very small change that was added into World of Warcraft. Curse of Weakness, Tongues, Recklessness, and Doom. And most curses are just going to be passives that won't make some huge playmakers in dungeons and raids, or at least it's unlikely, but I've enjoyed this particular style of extra added play and thought process when it comes to playing Warlock in general. For Affliction, but this also goes for Destruction and Demonology, while Curse of Doom might not be the coolest dot ever, just being able to put something extra on a boss can be fun. Where I find most fun is playing Curse of Weakness, Tongues, or Recklessness in order to help my groups out in dungeon situations. You got an enemy caster that's just super annoying and has a very fast cast, just drop down Curse of Tongues on them. You got enemies that are pounding the hell out of your tank, hit them with a Curse of Weakness, make it easier for your tank to manage the situation. And of course there's Curse of Recklessness, which I haven't really found that much use for, but maybe eventually I will. It occurs to stop enemies from playing combat, so maybe you would use it on a humanoid who in dungeons likes to run over to his pals and try to get him to attack. Yes, it will make the enemy a little bit more aggressive against your tank, but at least it will stop him from pulling extra. And that bit of little gameplay that is added to Warlocks, I personally enjoy. It's not huge, it's not revolutionary, it's not going to be some crazy new mechanic, you just throw a curse on an enemy, that's all it is. But I've personally enjoyed it, it's fun. It's also different because most characters in WoW use buffs in order to help allies. As a Warlock, you use debuffs on enemies, make enemies weaker so your allies can be stronger. And I like that type of playstyle. Going back to Affliction, what is new? The biggest change is going to be Malefic Rapture, which is an ability that consumes soul shards, and it's your one ability, or one of few, that consumes soul shards instead of Unstable Affliction, where it does shadow damage to every enemy affected by a dot, does more damage per dot on the enemy. So the amount of dots that you play with, specifically with talents, even in AoE, really does matter for Affliction now. The more dots and the more dots on multiple enemies you can put out, the better. Unstable Affliction is also baseline. It's a dot with no longer having a cost for a soul shard, but you only can have one of them at a time. So you'll put this on the enemy you're trying to nuke down, usually put it on the big baddie inside of a trash bag, and always try to maintain it on the boss. But that's an extra dot for you to manage, which feeds back into Malefic Rapture. With the change to Malefic Rapture, a talent like Vile Taint ends up being a better choice for AoE. Phantom Singularity is what everybody runs and it's the strongest dot, but Malefic Rapture doesn't treat Phantom Singularity as a damage over time ability. However, for a talent of Vile Taint, it now does. So as Affliction, if you wanted to have some cleave or AoE possibility and potential, now you can play Vile Taint as well as other talents that apply a dot with Rapture. The one talent I don't actually like is Siphon Life. Never really enjoyed it for single target. So for my build, I actually don't go for Siphon Life. Instead, I go for Vile Taint because it gives you a bit of cleave capability. I like Capsule Corruption or Wrath and Agony much better. And for this playstyle in particular, I have Drained Soul comboed together with Shadow's Embrace to almost be a manager of a bunch of enemies. Instead of managing inventory, I manage dots on multiple foes, and it's been actually quite fun. Let me show you a little bit. I have a couple Ash Ghouls here in one of the later zones of Revendreth. They're not really that bad of enemies. Most of them are going to get tanked by my Blueberry anyway. But what I like about Malefic Rapture, and I didn't realize this the first time I tested out Warlock until a guildie pointed out, is that Malefic Rapture can cleave. So essentially you can either treat this ability as like a bursty ability to spend soul shards, but you can use this as a cleave ability to put, let's say, on 10-20 enemies a bunch of dots and then start really hammering them with a spell, or load up a single enemy with the most amount of dots possible, all the debuffs in the world, and then start blasting them for every soul shard you have with Malefic Rapture. This is fun and kind of cool. So far in the alpha, I found that dots actually do quite a bit of damage. I mean, Malefic Rapture is still probably going to be your hardest hitting ability, which is going to feel pretty weird, but outside of pressing Malefic Rapture, which is going to be there for a bursty style situation, your dots do quite a lot of damage. So it's a mix together that works off of dots, based on dots, relies on dots, so it's still dot-based playstyle is the focus of the spec, but the way you interact with dots and the way you do damage based on how many dots you have, it's fun. I think this is the most amount of time I've said dots, dots, dots back and forth in a video, but I think that's essentially the only way to describe Affliction Warlock. Dots. A lot of dots. Oh, and Dark Glare. They kept Dark Glare in BFA, which is super nice. With so much dot management you need to do in this expansion so far. Oh, it's just so nice to have Dark Glare. One thing BFA did right. This easily translates really well into dungeons, because Affliction then becomes a spec that can manage with 1 target, 2 targets, or 10 targets because of the way your dots work. There's a bit more freedom in terms of how you access all your damage over time abilities. Damage over time being linked to just dots alone means that in a situation where you get overpowered with a variety of enemies, you don't have a cap on AoE. That's one of the things going into Shadowlands. A variety of classes are going to be cleave classes. They are going to have a limit on how many enemies they affect, but they are going to be a lot more effective. So if, let's say, you are an Outlaw Rogue or a Fury Warrior or a Marksmanship Hunter, you are designed in Shadowlands to be effective against 5 or less enemies. So as long as the AoE cap is at 5 or under, you'll be the most effective. Affliction Warlock plays with damage over time abilities, and damage over time doesn't really care about the cap of enemies. Neither does Malefic Rapture. It'll hit all enemies based on how many dots they have. So Affliction Warlock, in a sense, for the next expansion, is one of those classes that doesn't actually truly have an AoE cap, which could set it above the rest. It could be one of those specs that might be a little bit better at managing multiple enemies all at the same time, which could create a little bit of a niche, especially in a big pull, high octane Mythic Plus environment. And even though I said curses don't really mean that much when it comes to the gameplay, they are fun to use. Being able to debuff a bunch of enemies to make a pull much easier for your tank, especially knowing how overtuned everything is right now in the alpha. A lot of the bosses and mobs really hit way too hard. It is fun to be able to find a way where I can be helpful in more ways than just raw damage. And I think that's very much needed in World of Warcraft. Sometimes Blizzard cannot balance classes based on damage, but you can balance classes by giving them certain tools that would be invaluable, tools that are even better than raw damage alone. And for Warlocks to be able to mitigate how much damage enemies in a dungeon group might do to your healers or tanks or anybody in your party could put them ahead of some of the other classes. Not saying there will because it's too early in the alpha, and we will see the meta gameplay for Warlocks in general, but I think it's a good thing to give to Warlocks, like giving poisons to rogues. It's something extra to bring to the gameplay that isn't just overall damage focused. Where I had a lot of fun with my Affliction Warlock, in particular with this boss in a new dungeon added in the latest update for the alpha. This boss has a couple mechanics like a fear, which I can dispel because I'm running an imp pet, so I'm able to manage all the fears for our groups. The rest of the time for gameplay, I'm just watching out for boss position, some of the mechanics, managing my dots, throwing them on as soon as they fall off, and when I have nothing else to do, I stand there and just press drain life. The biggest differences that I felt in Shadowlands compared to BFA, in BFA I feel like I have to press Shadowbolt when there's a filler ability for me to press, because Shadowbolt in Battle for Azeroth does quite a significant portion of your damage. But in the alpha, I feel like I'm focusing on my dots, trying to make sure I'm getting the most value of my dots, and then if I have absolutely nothing else to do with dots, then I'm pressing Drain Soul. Maybe it could be just the damage breakdown, and trust me, I'm not really focusing nearly as much damage on my Warlock. As I told you before in other trash packs and with certain fights, I am focused on cursing, debuffing my enemies and trying to play to that playstyle. And it seems that enemies are still rotting while my dots are shredding through them. And maybe I'm wrong because we don't have recount or we can't access everything through WoW logs in the alpha to really analyze the numbers. So maybe it's just my personal experience, but never any moment during this dungeon that I feel that putting up curses and spending globals and curses was in any way impacting my overall damage. Well, that's gonna be the video for me on Affliction Warlocks. I'm actually very surprised and very much enjoying my Warlock right now in the alpha. It's super fun to play this manager playstyle of debuffing my foes and trying to do the most amount of damage with the most amount of dots. I feel that actual choices within talents really do feel fundamentally functional now in terms of giving you different gameplay and giving you different types of output depending on your playstyle. It's actually enjoyable being able to play other talents besides what you've been stuck with in Battle for Azeroth, and these are the talents that always had a cool idea behind them, but it just never really panned out in BFA. They're cool, but just weren't really all that amazing in the past. I do wonder how Warlocks will evolve as we play through the alpha, into the beta, into the release of Shadowlands. This is going to be my video on my thoughts and experiences with Affliction Warlock. A lot of you guys have asked, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this video with a little bit of this insight of where Affliction Warlock stands. I found them super fun, and it's one of those classes and specs I really want to play when Shadowlands comes out. I'm very hopeful to where they go, and I think they could be much better in the PvP aspect with the changes they've gotten on the alpha. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I very much hope you guys enjoyed. You guys let me know your thoughts on the Affliction Warlocks on the alpha, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.